In 1955, on 8th May, Baba Ambedkar addressed a public gathering in Mumbai before 80,000 people in attendance, and that was on the occasion of the Buddha Jayanti. And there he talked about two types of people in Buddhism, and I found these two types of people in Buddhism very interesting. So he said one type of a person has orientation of a researcher, and we can call it today the scholarly pursuit. And there are other kinds of people who have the orientation of a mission, and that mission is to spread Buddhism, propagate Buddhism. So two kinds of people: one who are research oriented, and other is a missionary type of people, and whose mission is to spread and propagate Buddhism. And Dr. Baba Ambedkar says that my duty or our duty is to spread Buddhism and convert our people. I think that's very remarkable that Dr. Baba Ambedkar, the well-trained mind in researching in so many disciplines, when he is classifying these two kinds of people, he's saying that my main duty or our main duty is to spread Buddhism and convert our people in Buddhism. So with this framework, these two pursuits, I am going to present my ideas about Baba Saheb Ambedkar and Buddhism. So it's very clear that the mission of Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar was to spread and propagate Buddhism in India and convert the scheduled caste back to their ancestral religion. So that was what his calling was on 8th May 1955. And as I said, though he was a scholar par excellence, Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar chose this path of spreading the Buddhism. But it doesn't mean that he didn't have the scholarly pursuit. Of course, we know that Baba Saheb Ambedkar posed an open challenge to anyone who would like to debate on Buddhism with him, and has written incisive tracts on critiques of Buddhism. Particularly, we have seen in the Mahabodhi journal where he has responded to the critique of the Buddha that he was opposed to the women, and Baba Saheb Ambedkar has written this very incisive tract which we know today as the rise and fall of Hindu women. And there was a debate with Savarkar where Savarkar was calling the Buddha as having weakened the country because of his doctrine of peace, and Baba Saheb Ambedkar argued very vehemently against him. And Savarkar's points were so confused that Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar used to challenge him to come up with the right arguments, and he would answer all the claims. So it didn't mean that Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar denounced the scholarly pursuit, but his aim was to propagate Buddhism. And when we think about Buddhism and Baba Saheb Ambedkar, we think that Buddhism came in 1956 when he became the Buddhist. But if you look at the life of Baba Saheb Ambedkar himself, we see that the Buddhism was very deeply rooted in Baba Saheb's life, and he has his self-testimony a few times where he said that I became Buddhist when Dada Keluskar gifted me the copy of Gautama Buddha in 1907. And I think this book itself has a history. It came into being when Buddhism was known throughout India, among the scholarly and educated circle. The PTS Society was founded in 1885. Sayajirao Maharaj himself had this Gaikwad Oriental series through which this book was published, and there was enough sort of information, knowledge about Buddhism. And Dada Keluskar was, of course, a very profound scholar, and he came up with this book Gautama Buddha, which people say that it was Jyotiba Phule inspired him to write two books, two biographies, rather three. He also wrote the biography of the Tukaram Maharaj, he wrote the biography of Shivaji, and of course the Buddha. And there are other testimonies which gives us a very clear picture. Rahul Walapola, who was one of the leading intellectuals in the 60s and the 70s, he wrote in the World Buddhism magazine in 1969, in the March edition, that Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar himself told him that he became Buddhist when he was just a boy of 16. And then we have many testimonies in the 20s and the 30s which talks about Baba Saheb's fascination for Buddhism. Venerable Loknath, of course, in 1933, he has went on record to write how Baba Saheb Ambedkar was deeply moved by the Buddha. He had this solitary picture of the Buddha in his room. Then 1920, in the Mangaon conference, where Shahuji Maharaj was there, Bhikshu Bodhananda, from a very well-known Mahastavir of that period, student of Mahavir, Bante Mahavir, and very related to, known to Chandramani. He was also there in 1920 Mangaon conference. So it is not that Baba Saheb Ambedkar was not exposed to Buddhism. His other footsteps of Buddhism in very early on, that when he traveled from India to Columbia University, according to Banoda, the Hindi biographer who interviewed Baba Saheb Ambedkar and came up with his biography, he mentions in his biography that Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, when he was traveling to New York, to Columbia University in 1913, he was carrying the Buddhist books with him. And we have at least one record where Baba Saheb Ambedkar has inscribed his signature in 1915 on the book written by Rhys Davis. And he was well acquainted with Davis' work, both husband and wife. And his thesis, Ancient Indian Commerce, he refers to the commercial activities referring to the Buddhist texts. And then afterwards we know that he has been visiting the Buddhist sites. He named his house after Rajagriha, schools and colleges after the Buddha, Buddhist figures, and many Buddhist references we can see sprinkling through his writings. And in 1943 he was a patron of a Buddhist institute which was started by Bodhananda, and he has taken what we can say the Diksha in 1915 in Delhi with his wife, before he went to attend the WFB conference in 1950. Not only that, but we can see the scholarly imprints in Baba Saheb's life, like he has written insightful articles. One of them I referred before in the Mahabodhi Society Journal, and in 1941 he wrote a very foundational article in Janta, which was titled as in Marathi as the Buddha Jayanti आणि तिचे राजकीय महत्व, and in English it comes like the Buddha Jayanti and its political significance. A very important article in 1941 where he is asking the Indians to take the Buddha as a model if they want to go on the path of the democracy. And he says that they all need to chant the greatest mantra, Maha Mantra, Buddhang Saranam Gacchami, Dhammang Saranam Gacchami, Sangham Saranam Gacchami, 1941. And then he had been delivering many speeches for the local, national and international audiences even before he formally so-called embraced Buddhism in the mass ceremony. And I have gone through a lot of his collections, and he had numerous books in his collections from all the schools and philosophies of Buddhism. He had subscriptions of all the major Buddhist periodicals of the time, like Buddhist Review, World Buddhism, Light of Dhamma, and you name it, Mahabodhi Society journals, and so on. And he had in his possession the archaeological reports and arts, and I had seen a book in Marathi published in 1915 in his collection when I went to the Siddharth College. And we know that he himself was a Pali scholar, and he had been studying Pali with Ishwar Datta Medharthi and the great people like that. And he had had a vision of translating the Pali Tripitaka and Sanskrit text in Marathi. So that information now we can find in the volumes of the World Buddhism. So there is a lot to be known. What we are just looking at is just the tip of the iceberg. So why Baba Saheb Ambedkar was so fascinated with Buddhism? As a matter of fact, Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar was very fascinated with religions, and he knew, and he has said a number of times that the religion is essential for the society. And he himself had said many times that he was a deeply religious man, and he was brought up in a religious atmosphere because his father himself was a Kabir Panthi. He was an independent thinker who imbibed the value of independent thinking, imbibed the values of Kabir very deeply in Baba Saheb's mind. And his father was converted to Kabir Panth. He was not a traditional man. He came to Kabir Panth by by his own intellectual prowess, as it were. So Baba Ambedkar was very deeply religious man, as he has himself said, and he deeply studied all the religions of the world, and he compared very early on the very different religious system. He of course could not accept Hinduism because it is founded on the graded inequality, and we know his critique of Hinduism in so many of his writings and speeches. He had of course looked at Islam, and he found the brotherhood in Islam interesting, but he found that the brotherhood in Islam is limited only to the Islamic communities. There was an absence of the human brotherhood, or what we can say today as a universal brotherhood in Islam. And he was of course fond of the personality of Jesus, but he abhorred the caste system in Indian Christianity. He didn't like the caste system in Indian Christianity. He told in front of the Christian audiences in Ahmednagar that he didn't like the caste system in Christianity in India. And he regarded Adi Grantha as the challenge to Manusmriti. And of course Adi Grantha is a challenge to Manusmriti because it contains the writings of the radical saint poets like Kabir and Raidas, Nama and Nanak himself, that they were the radical critique of the Brahminical Hinduism. And very early on he became very fond of the personality of the Buddha, and he understood that the Buddha had this very deep challenge to the superstition, the idea of the creator God and soul. So we can see that he was deeply into religion and the religious studies. So the question arises why he was so fond of the Buddha very early on, because he regarded the Buddha as been a teacher of wisdom and compassion, and the Buddha was the person who taught that the wisdom and compassion can lead the humanity out of suffering. And according to Baba Ambedkar, all the religions had this triangular sort of a peace arrangement where the relationship between the two human beings was mediated through the God. There was no direct relationship between the human beings. And this Baba Ambedkar found very interesting, that Buddhism has human brotherhood at its heart without intervention of any third agency. There is no need of any third power to establish relationship between the two human beings as to how they should accord or behave or be in relationship with other human beings. And we realized very early on that Buddhism is not a personal religion, and to Baba Ambedkar, even the Buddhism itself didn't qualify for the definition of religion. And as the scholarship is now coming forward, the concept of religion itself is a very new, it's not very old concept. So the idea of Baba Ambedkar as to why he was fascinated by the Buddha was because the Buddha doesn't only talk about what he called the Adhyatmic Dukkha, which is related to the individuals, and he says that the individual suffering can be easily done away with by the practice of the Panchashila. Baba Ambedkar was very impressed by the Buddha's teachings of removing what he called the Adhibhautik Dukkha, or social suffering, or Samudayik Dukkha. And I think this aspect is very important because for Baba Ambedkar, the other religions might have to do with them and their God, but for Buddhism, according to Baba Ambedkar, has to do everything with one human being's relationship with other human beings. And if this relationship is based on inequality, how does that lead to what he termed as the Samudayik Dukkha? And he goes very deeply in his speech, in his talk which he gave, or a pravachan which he gave in Sopara, where he went to celebrate the Buddha Jayanti with a few of his followers. And on the very occasion of the Buddha Jayanti, 6 May 1955, and there he talked about these three dukkhas, and Samudayik Dukkha, or what we can call the social suffering, intrigued Dr. Baba Ambedkar so much that he has gone into the very depth of it. And then again, the third type of suffering that Dr. Baba Ambedkar found was the suffering because of the natural disasters like earthquakes and all. We cannot do much about it, but we can certainly do everything about to remove the Samudayik Dukkha, or even the individual suffering, Adhyatmic Dukkha and Samudayik Dukkha, as Baba Ambedkar would call in Marathi. So that's what fascinated Baba Ambedkar so much about the personality of the Buddha, and he was in the awe of the Buddha so much that he had this very personal faith and fascination for the Buddha very early on. One of the things that Baba Saheb Ambedkar was fascinated by Buddhism, because one of the very important pithy statements in the Buddhist Dhamma is this: Dhamma is essentially and fundamentally social. So understanding human beings in terms of his relationship with other human beings was a very key point in the thinking or the philosophizing of Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, and he was a very clear, articulate thinker. He tried to define the Buddhism or the Dhamma in terms of what the Buddha actually said about his Dhamma, and we all know about the definition of Dhamma as to it is Bahujan Hitaya, Bahujan Sukhaya, Lokanukampaya, Hitaya Sukhaya, Deva Manussanam, Dhammang Adi Kalyanang, Madhya Kalyanang, and Anta Kalyanang. This is a very precise definition as to what the Buddha's Dhamma constitute of and what its vision is. It's the vision of the welfare and the happiness of the many people, and it is in resonance with the people. Lokanukampaya, kampan of course means resonance, and lok means of course people, resonating with the people, and that's very well captured in the four Brahma Vihar in terms of the Metta, Karuna, Mudita, and Upekha. I'm not going to go into that, but the way Baba Saheb Ambedkar thinks and brings out the clarity to us is very interesting and very important for us to understand when we are looking at this topic of Ambedkar and Buddhism. I would like to once again recite it, his definition that is directly picked up from the Buddhist scriptures: Bahujana Hitaya, Bahujan Sukhaya, Lokanukampaya, Hitaya Sukhaya, Deva Manussanam, Dhammang, Adi Kalyanang, Madhya Kalyanang, and Anta Kalyanang. So, that's how he was deeply fascinated by the Buddha. Now, we cannot look at Ambedkar and Buddhism without looking at his monumental work, the Buddhist Dhamma. I'm not going to go much into that, but to me it's like a guide to understand the heart of Baba Saheb Ambedkar. And this book, I have gone through some of the notes that he has written as preparation for this book, and he has spent like 6 years. He had in the 40s himself. He wanted to write the book on the Buddha, but it took him a long time. So when he started in the 50s to write about this book, the Buddhist Dhamma, he has studied the Tripitakas very deeply, and I have seen he has gone after a single word, looking at how that word appears in different Buddhist suttas, and he has this list of all the suttas and what are the important topics in that suttas. So he has done a very meticulous study of the so-called classical Buddhist texts, and he not only you can see some content from the Diamond Sutta there, which is located in the Buddhist Dhamma, is a very important point of the discussion, and he has this very way of systematically analyzing the text and very clear and precise presentation. So Baba Saheb Ambedkar, as I would say, because it's his earnest desire to translate by himself the Pali text into the Marathi, qualifies him as a Tripitakacharya, because he was somebody who has gone into depth of the Pali text, Pali language, so much so that we know that he has written a dictionary, English dictionary, Pali and English. He was attempting a 4-language dictionary of Pali. He could only finish a alphabet, and if he had lived longer, we would have seen this massive dictionary coming up. And writing dictionary is not an easy task. If we can understand the processes of writing the dictionaries in English or other languages, see, it's a very laborious process. You have to go after the meaning of each and every word, and etymological meaning of the word, the meaning of the word in the context. So we can see that you have this profound insight into the Tripitakas and other Buddhist texts. Just by the way of I would say testimony is Rahul Sankrita, another great Buddhist scholar. He says that if Baba Saheb Ambedkar has been alive at the time of the Buddha, he would have been one of his leading disciples. I think that statement is very important, very important. It's coming from Rahul Sankrita, and he himself a Tripitakacharya and a master of so many schools of Buddhism. When he makes a statements like that, it has a very deep way. Mahathiro Chandramani said that Baba Ambedkar can talk about anything when it comes to Buddhism. This is Mahathiro Chandramani, he's the bhikshu that gave him a diksha. And there are other thinkers, like if we look at Lalamani Joshi, the kind of tributes he pays to Baba Ambedkar, that he's somebody who has done so much that it was not done before in the history of a country. So you see, these are very important things to understand the position or the status of Baba Ambedkar as a Tripitakacharya, as a scholar, as a practitioner, as somebody who has given this very monumental work, the Buddha and his Dhamma. And I have been studying the Buddha and his Dhamma for a long time, but when I go back to it, I find a lot of things which are very, very interesting. One of the things that Baba Ambedkar has remarked, that in the history of Buddhism there had been some organizational loopholes, and in Marathi he called the Shidra, from which the dirty water has come into the Buddhist organization. And he one of his aims was to how he can plug hole that gap which has entered into the Buddhist organization. And one of the things that Baba Ambedkar had done, and I think this is very remarkable when it comes to the topic of Ambedkar and Buddhism, is that he institutionalized what we can say the Dhamma Diksha. And I think that's a very radical step. Before Baba Ambedkar came with this vision of Dhamma Diksha, we could see that the only authenticate Diksha that there was the Sangha Diksha. People had this formula where people could become the member of the Sangha, but Dhamma Diksha was absent, and in the absence of Dhamma Diksha led to the decline of the institution of Buddhism. And I think that's a very interesting point. And Baba Ambedkar himself was very keen to organize the Buddhists on the local level, on the national level, and of course he had made the foray and played a role in the formation of the World Fellowship of Buddhists, and he was one of the founding members of that. And locally, he was talking about the Bauddha Panchayat Samiti and the Bauddha Mahasabha. So you can see that he was trying to organize the Buddhist, because he found that without this organization of the Buddhists, there is a threat to Buddhism. And he of course stressed on Vihara as the center of the Buddhist community life. He has stressed so much on the local Vihars. He of course founded organizationally the Buddhist educational institutes, which according to Baba Ambedkar, they were meant to propagate, preach Buddhism, look at Buddhism. And the names itself, like the Siddhartha College or Milind College, indicate the desire of Baba Ambedkar. He has this plan of setting up the Buddhist seminary in Bangalore, which he had acquired the land, but it couldn't come into being. But he had this plan, and to plug the institutional weaknesses or the institutional shortcomings in the historical Buddhism, he looked at Buddhism as some kind of the total solvent of all the identities. Particularly, he said that the dirty water of Hinduism has entered into our gullies, into our localities, and we are also divided into subcaste, and the new economic class is emerging among the scheduled caste. So he said that the Buddhism will be a great solvent to dissolve all these identities. He of course looked at the Buddhism as dissolving all the identities. And one of the things to institutionalize the Buddhism, Baba Ambedkar laid emphasis on Buddhism as supportive to the Indian democracy, as supportive to the Indian constitution. He said that there is nothing in the Buddha and his Dhamma which contradicts the Indian constitution. These are very remarkable things that Baba Ambedkar has given us, and we have to think very carefully when we talk about the Ambedkar and Buddhism topic. Now, Baba Ambedkar himself has had this great vision, very deep, very broad, very insightful understanding of Buddhism. And as I said in the beginning, that his aim was to spread Buddhism. Of course, he was a Buddhist scholar, but his aim was to preach, propagate Buddhism. And we have to, when we think about this, we have to look at today as to where we are in terms of what Baba Ambedkar would have cautioned us about. he was completely up against what we can say exclusive monastic Buddhism. And in one of his letters, he has said that he prefers monastic Buddhism to humanistic Buddhism. And in his innumerable writings and speeches, we see that the human being is the center of the Buddha's Dhamma. And he emphasized that the monastics should not just be concerned with perfection. And there is a very beautiful discussion that we see in the Buddha and his Dhamma and other writings. The monastics should also be very socially oriented. They should be able to serve the society. The another thing that Baba Ambedkar would have cautioned us against was against the technique-centered Buddhism. There are so many techniques like the meditation techniques that we see in proliferation all over the places, and people regard those techniques as sacrosanct. And Baba Ambedkar would have definitely cautioned us against the technique-centered Buddhism. The third thing that Baba Ambedkar would have cautioned us against is the guru-based Buddhism. He would have critiqued vehemently if the Buddhism has proposed some kind of a guru-based Buddhism. Of course, we know that Baba Ambedkar was not for over-emphasis on Abhidhamma and meditation. We can go into depth of why he was not very much inclined to emphasize so much on Abhidhamma and meditation, and we will look briefly as to how Baba Ambedkar related to meditation. So this would be Baba Ambedkar's cautions, very important cautions. One of the sentences of Baba Ambedkar which appeals to me and is that the Dhamma accepted by the pure mind is the leader itself. And the Buddha has told this to Ananda when he was talking about the leadership in Buddhism. He said that after you are gone, who is going to lead us? And the Buddha told him that the Dhamma accepted by the pure mind is the leader. This is a very, very interesting definition, and it resonates with the kind of the scholarship that has been coming up by the monks who are studying very deeply into Buddhism and also practicing very deeply into Buddhism. This resonates with what is the current thinking now, that the Dhamma accepted by the pure mind is the leader itself. And of course the emphasis on the social and moral, and he was for the inclusion of each and everyone. So when we think about Ambedkar and Buddhism, we have to think about these very, very important salient points when we try to look at the status of Ambedkar and Buddhism today. So I thought, by the way of making it more contemporary, I would bring up these points. Another controversial points about the emphasized by the people is this, that what is Baba Saheb Ambedkar's position on meditation. And of course, the meditation is a very new word, and Baba Saheb Ambedkar had talked about the meditation in the English sense of the word and in the Buddhist sense of the word in one of his notes that I have in the possession, where Baba Saheb Ambedkar talks about the Western way of making sense of meditation is thinking in abstract way, taking ideas and comparing it with other ideas and the memories. But the Buddhist way of meditation is to take one idea and apply the total energy of the mind into that. And one of the notes contains Baba Saheb Ambedkar's very clear view on the Buddhist meditation, which he takes from Ananda Sutta, the sutta that Ananda taught to one bhikshuni. And you see that content of the sutta has been now coming up for again and again in the scholarly writings as to what constitute the Buddhist meditation. And that resonates with the meditation practices of Kabir and Raidas, not indulging into liking and disliking, the two forces of raga and dosa, but engaging mind into something positive, the kusala thoughts. And you see this conception of meditation as an active practice in the world, 24 hours, becoming aware of what is happening at our six sense doors, not just sitting meditation, but the approach of Satipatthana. In Satipatthana Sutta, we don't find the mention of what the sitting meditation. It's like being aware every time, whether we are standing, walking, sitting, talking, doing whatever. You just have to bring this bare attention, awareness to everything that we do. And I think that has been now a very interesting, important practice in the world today, particularly in some of the Burmese tradition, and that has been a part and parcel of the meditation tradition of Kabir and Raidas when they talk about the Sahaja Samadhi, the bare awareness that we can bring even now when I'm talking and you are listening to me. And I think, but the problem is that we don't sustain it for long, and the Buddha has taught that sustain it for 24/7, and that is the perspective we can see in Baba Sahib's writings. When he talks about Samma Sati and Samma Samadhi, very clear articulation as to what constitute the Buddhist meditation. And like the Buddha, he doesn't prescribe a technique. He prescribes a general sort of a principles as to how we can cultivate the awareness. And in one of the pravachans, I would say, Baba Ambedkar had defined sati in a very unique way. Of course, the way the Buddha teaches that sati is the mindfulness of feelings arising in the body, and we have to be observant of the feelings arising in the body and the mind 24/7. And he of course talks about Satipatthana briefly in the Buddha and his Dhamma. He talks about Samma Samadhi as a training to cultivate wisdom and Kusala Kamma by cultivation of the awareness. A lot more can be talked about this, because these days people are so much fascinated by the meditation techniques that they become very much attached to the techniques that they practice. So I cannot do a lot of this elaboration in such a small thing, but if you continue to look at the writing and speeches of Baba Ambedkar, which are there in a vast number, and for the people who can read Marathi, in the volume 18 part 3, there are so many of his insightful speeches delivered in Marathi that we begin to get the complete understanding of many things. So when we look at Baba Ambedkar and Buddhism, we have to of course look at where are we today and how we can go further on the vision of Baba Ambedkar to bring back Buddhism in India. These are the fundamental questions that should arise in our minds. So when we look at where are we today, we know that there are hundreds of Buddha Vihars, not only in Maharashtra but increasingly throughout India. There is no place in India at this point of time where the followers of Baba Ambedkar are not taking the Buddha as his guide, as their guide, looking at and not looking at the Buddha and his Dhamma. They are looking at studying the Buddha and his Dhamma. Thousands of people gather in Vihar on different occasions. There are Vihars where people gather on the day-to-day basis, but on the special occasion, there are many hundreds of Vihars where people gather. This is not something which is normal. You imagine that so many hundreds of people. And one of the tests that Baba Ambedkar has given, whether the Buddhism is proliferation, spreading, or whether Buddhism is a live force. When he went to Sri Lanka in 1950, he went there and told people that I came here to see how your Buddhism is doing. And he said that the test of whether the Buddhism is doing well in this country is to see how many young people are interested in Buddhism. And I think that is the most important test as to how many young people are interested in Buddhism. And if you look at the other Buddhist countries, you will say that the Buddhism is very senile, very old people are coming to that. But India, at least the young people are taking interest, and I think that's a very interesting point. That
hello, Daiwalaji.
Yes.
Please unmute yourself.
Unmute?
Someone muted you. Okay, I will mute yourself.
So how long I was muted?
Hello, can you hear me?
How long I was muted? Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Mangesh, we cannot hear you.
But I didn't do anything.
Please unmute yourself.
Okay. So how long I was muted?
Just 2 minutes, one, 2.
Okay. So I was talking about where are we today in terms of Ambedkar and Buddhism. We have hundreds of Buddha Vihars, not only in Maharashtra but increasingly throughout India. There will be hardly any part of India where this awakening is not taking place. To some extent, there are thousands of people who gather, and one of the tests that Baba Ambedkar saw, where the Buddhism, if the Buddhism is dynamic, He went to Sri Lanka in 1950 and he says that I came here to see whether the Buddhism is alive. And he says the test whether the Buddhism is alive is whether the young people are taking interest in the Dhamma. And I think the same applies here. And when you look at the other Buddhist countries, we see that it's very senile Buddhism. Old people take interest in Buddhism, not so many young people. But when you look at the Indian context, there are many young people who are interested in Buddhism. It might be because India is a young nation, but the interest in Buddhism is coming from the younger generations. There are many organizations which are working in India, throughout India on Buddhism. The archaeological sites, the holy sites are now frequented. Whenever I visit the holy sites associated with Buddha, I see hundreds of Buddhists coming from Maharashtra now, but also some parts of India frequenting the holy places. There is an interesting interest in the Pali language. I reckon that your department itself has many people who are taking the Pali studies very seriously. Same with the Mumbai University, same with Nagpur University and in Aurangabad. So people are so deeply taking interest in learning this classical language, which is something very special and unique. So I think there is a lot of synergy, a lot of energy which is there in India at the moment. The kind of impetus that Baba Sahib Ambedkar has given us, but it's not enough. We have to go many steps forward, and I have a deep faith in that moment which took place on the 14th October 1956, that it unleashed a force which is unstoppable. It cannot be stopped. And I think, what can we do from here? The first thing that we need to do is to embrace the Buddhist vision of Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar fully and totally, not 1% here and there. We have to get completely into grip of Baba Sahib's vision. We have to have a total faith in the vision and mission of Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar and his thought process. Of course, we have to fight the monster of caste, to remove the caste within, if it is coming up in Buddhism. We have to also see how we can organize at all levels, at local level, national level, and of course at international level. And we have to steer clear from the emerging trends in Buddhism, because there are so many trends in Buddhism that can mislead us. So we have to be very clearly understand and articulate the vision and the mission of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. And as Baba Sahib Ambedkar said, that the Buddhist mission is not an easy task. We have to strive each and every moment to further this cause of the spread and propagation of Buddhism. And I think if we understand these basic points of Baba Sahib Ambedkar's vision of Buddhism, his understanding of Buddhism, if we start grappling with that, if we start studying with that, if we start digging deeply into this particular dimension of Baba Sahib Ambedkar, it will propel the revival of Buddhist movement by many folds. So there is a lot, as I said, can be said. There are so many things to be exhumed even today. There are so many things to be known. There is so much research has to be done, because for a long time Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar was a neglected person. Now in the recent time he's emerging as a figure, but recently there was in the past there was like what we can say conspiracy of silence over his movement. There were a lot of wrong views which were propagated by the people, and now because of this awakening, because of this the awakened interest in Baba Sahib Ambedkar from last 20-30 years, the things have been changing very drastically and radically, and I'm hopeful that this thing is going to be so massive that it will become a kind of a force that cannot be stopped by anybody. So I just wanted to throw some of my not my ideas, what Baba Sahib Ambedkar looked how he looked at Buddhism, and I think this will give you some food of thought which we can discuss and in the Q&A that will follow my talk. So I stop here and open up the class for the Q&A.